In April of 1865, a rural family in Pennsylvania learned that history does not always arrive through newspapers or speeches. Sometimes it enters through a kitchen door, asks for water, and changes everything without raising its voice. The water drawn from the well remained cold, unaltered by the April sun that had already settled with confidence over the Conestoga Valley by mid-morning. Isaac worked the bucket upward with practiced motion, pulling hand over hand as the hemp rope rasped against itself, a sound shaped by years of moisture, friction, and use. The farm lay in a shallow depression of land in central Lancaster County, several miles east of the borough's seat, where the earth sloped gently toward a narrow tributary feeding the Conestoga Creek before rising again into fields that had been plowed during the last clear days of March 1865 and now waited, dark and open, for seed. By late morning the day had assumed its expected order. Hens scratched along the packed earth near the porch steps, pausing and resuming without pattern. The dry, faintly sweet residue of winter hay lingered in the air, disturbed occasionally by movement from the barn. Sunlight spread gradually across the pine boards of the house as it climbed higher, warming wood that had known far colder mornings only weeks earlier. Nothing in the arrangement of the farm suggested interruption. The land neither anticipated nor acknowledged events beyond its boundaries. Inside, Mary set the kitchen table with the same economy of motion she had practiced since the earliest years of her marriage. The linen cloth, faded along the hem from repeated boiling and lye soap, was smoothed flat with the heel of her hand before the plates were placed. Bread baked before dawn, as it often was on Fridays, had been sliced while still warm, the crust yielding with a soft, familiar break beneath the knife. A pot of weak coffee rested at the back of the iron stove, its grounds reused more than once. And the morning's milk sat in glazed earthenware jars, their mouths covered with muslin and twine to keep out flies as the temperature rose. Each object occupied its habitual position. For Mary, order was not abstract or assumed. It was produced daily through attention and repetition, sustained by the belief, widely shared among farm households, that care, applied consistently, could keep disorder at a manageable distance. The clock mounted above the sink, its case darkened with age and handling, marked a little past 11 when Anna first noticed footsteps on the dirt path leading from the turnpike toward the house. The sound lacked the steady rhythm of neighboring farmers accustomed to stopping by to speak of fences, market prices in Lancaster, or the condition of the roads after winter. These steps were uneven, neither hurried nor assured. Anna stood at the south-facing window, watching high spring clouds drift slowly across a pale sky that offered no promise of rain. Without raising her voice, she called for her father, careful not to disturb the settled stillness of the late morning. Isaac wiped his hands on the canvas apron he wore for chores and opened the door. The man standing on the threshold was thin, road dust clinging to his boots and to the hem of his dark coat. A wooden peddler's box hung from his shoulder by a worn leather strap, the sort carried by men who moved between Philadelphia and the interior counties on foot or by hired wagon, a trade documented regularly in county court dockets and rural newspaper advertisements of the period. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than age alone could account for. He removed his hat immediately and asked for water, his politeness practiced to the point of habit. Still, his gaze refused to settle, shifting from floor to wall to window, and Mary, hearing him from inside, felt a brief, indistinct hesitation she could not have named. She brought the water in a chipped stoneware pitcher. The man drank without stopping, as though he had delayed, asking longer than he should have. Some spilled onto his chin before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. He exhaled heavily and rested his palm on the edge of the table, the gesture tentative, as if seeking permission before words were exchanged. Isaac motioned him to sit. The peddler set the box at his feet, but did not open it, did not loosen the clasp, as traveling sellers often did when they sensed a chance for trade. The silence stretched beyond comfort, filled only by the steady tick of the clock and the distant movement of hens in the yard. Mary placed bread and milk before him out of habit rather than invitation. He inclined his head in thanks, but did not touch either. His fingers interlaced on his knee, trembling just enough to be noticed if one looked closely. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, as though he feared the words might pass through the open window and scatter across the fields. He said he had come from Philadelphia that morning, having left the city before dawn on the westward road. He said the city had felt wrong since the previous night, unsettled in a way he struggled to define, as if it were holding its breath. He chose his words carefully, each one weighted. Flags still flew in the streets, he said, following the formal surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, yet the celebration had taken on an unfinished quality, as though it had been interrupted without explanation. A sentiment echoed in contemporary Philadelphia broadsides and diary entries from mid-April. Anna felt a tightening in her stomach without understanding why. She thought of her younger brother, too young to grasp why their father sometimes fell silent when the mail arrived from town. She thought of the long months just past, when the war had been spoken of as distant, even as casualty lists were read aloud during Sunday services, often copied verbatim from county newspapers. The man lowered his eyes to the table, to Mary's hands gripping the cloth, to the thick, work-marked knuckles of Isaac's fingers. There was urgency in him, a need to pass something along before moving on. He said the president had been killed. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain at once. He allowed the sentence to remain between them, fragile, as though it might break if handled too quickly. Mary felt her legs weaken and steadied herself against the back of a chair, the rough grain pressing into her palm. The name that followed was one she had known for years without ever seeing the man himself. Abraham Lincoln, a name printed on newspapers later used to wrap dry goods, spoken in sermons calling for unity and endurance. Isaac froze with his cup halfway to his mouth, as though the ordinary act of swallowing had momentarily escaped him. The kitchen seemed to contract, its walls pressing inward. The peddler spoke of a theater on 10th Street, Ford's Theater, of an evening meant for celebration on April 14th, 1865, of a single gunshot no one had expected after 4 years of distant, relentless noise. The news, he said, was spreading through Philadelphia with the speed of fire and dry timber, though many spoke in lowered voices, as if saying it aloud might make it irrevocable. He offered no further detail. None was required. No one spoke for several moments. The clock continued its work without pause. Mary thought of the past winter, of letters that arrived late or not at all, of names no longer read aloud because hope had been exhausted. She thought of the president's face, always rendered the same way in engravings, familiar and remote. Isaac finally set his cup down with exaggerated care, as though any sharper sound might cause the truth to settle more firmly. The man apologized, as if he had carried something unwelcome across the threshold. He said he needed to continue on the road before nightfall. Mary urged him to eat before leaving. He took a piece of bread at last, chewing slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. When he stood, he thanked them again, adjusted the strap of his box, and walked down the porch steps without looking back, turning east toward the main road. After he was gone, the silence remained. Outside, the fields were unchanged, the sun bright on freshly turned soil, the leaves of the old oak moving slightly in the spring wind. Inside the kitchen, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. Mary cleared the table without speaking. Isaac remained seated, staring at the empty space the man had occupied, as though waiting for someone to say that a mistake had been made. Anna stood at the window. She did not yet have language for it, but she understood that the ordinary midday she had just lived through had become a division in time, a quiet before and after that would follow her, even as everything else appeared, improbably, to remain the same. Morning arrived without announcement or alteration, marked only by the same pale light entering the kitchen at its familiar angle, catching suspended dust and laying a narrow band across the scrub tabletop. Mary woke before the clock sounded, though she could not later have identified the reason. She remained seated on the edge of the bed longer than usual, her feet on the cold floorboards, listening as the house released the small, habitual sounds of early day, with contracting a distant stir from the barn, the faint settling that followed night. Nothing was wrong in any definable sense, yet the quiet felt attentive, as though awaiting instruction. Isaac was already awake when she entered the kitchen shortly after 5. He stood at the stove, stirring the coffee slowly, his movements deliberate and contained. He watched the fields beyond the south-facing window, without clearly focusing on any one point, his gaze resting somewhere between distance and thought. They did not speak of the man from the road, or of the words delivered the day before. The silence between them was not denial but postponement, shaped by long habit and necessity. There were animals to tend, bread to portion, water to draw. The day asserted its claims regardless of what had altered beneath its surface. Anna noticed the change as soon as she came downstairs. Her father spoke little, and her mother lingered over simple tasks, extending motions that once had been efficient, as though time itself might fray if handled too abruptly. Her younger brother complained that the bread had grown hard overnight and asked repeatedly for more milk, his insistence striking Anna as disproportionately loud. She watched him more closely than usual, unsettled by how untouched he remained, by how easily the world continued for him. The contrast disturbed her in a way she could not yet explain. Isaac went out to the barn before sunrise. The smell of livestock, the familiar warmth rising from their bodies in the cool April air, usually steadied him. That morning it did less. His hands continued their work, feeding, checking latches, clearing straw, while his thoughts returned repeatedly to the kitchen table, to the way the peddler had held his hat, to the measured cadence of a sentence that had carried such weight. It troubled him that something occurring more than 70 miles east, in a city he rarely visited, could enter his life so completely and without consent. By midday, confirmation arrived. A neighbor riding past on the road from Lancaster slowed his horse and called out, his voice subdued, his words brief. Yes, it was true. Yes, the reports were already appearing in handbills and extra editions, printed hastily and distributed ahead of the regular papers. No one yet knew what would follow. The exchange lasted no more than a minute, but when Isaac returned to his work, he felt a pressure lodged behind his ribs. The war had formally ended less than a week earlier, yet this development felt less like closure than the opening of something unsettled and undefined. That Sunday, the church was fuller than usual. People who ordinarily remained at home made the journey, filling the pews with restrained movement and quiet speech. The sermon addressed loss without dwelling on particulars, turning instead toward uncertainty and obligation in unsettled times. No instructions were offered, no clear course proposed, yet Mary felt the words directed toward her and toward the congregation as a whole. What she heard was not reassurance, but expectation, the sense that endurance alone would no longer suffice. Anna observed the adults carefully. She noted how often eyes shifted away from one another, how conversation slowed or stopped before reaching conclusion. It occurred to her, with a restrained shock, that grown people did not always know how to proceed, that they carried unanswered questions and continued forward regardless. For the first time, she understood that history was not only something recorded afterward in print, but something that pressed upon ordinary people and demanded response without preparation. A reality reflected in private diaries and correspondence from April 1865, where certainty gave way to speculation within the span of days. The days that followed accumulated small signals. Newspapers arrived later than usual, their pages creased and stained from multiple hands, the headlines heavy with language that felt simultaneously excessive and insufficient. Isaac read them in the evenings by lamplight, tracing the columns without comment. Mary did not read them at all, yet absorbed their content through remarks overheard at the mill and at the market, through conversations that halted when she approached. There was talk of anger, of uncertainty, of the necessity of order. None of it was precise enough to grasp firmly, but all of it suggested that calm could no longer be assumed. At night, Mary lay awake listening as the house contracted and settled. She thought of the children, of the planting season soon to begin, of how fragile continuity now seemed. She had never believed life to be simple, but she had trusted its patterns. Those patterns now felt thinner, more exposed to forces she could neither see nor influence. The death of Abraham Lincoln was not merely a political event to her. It was evidence that distance offered no reliable protection. Isaac sensed the same shift, though he would not have named it as such. He resisted, almost instinctively, the pull toward larger abstractions. He wanted the world to remain bounded by fences, by soil that could be turned, measured, and reclaimed. Yet even as he worked, he recognized that withdrawal no longer functioned as it once had. The noise of public events, previously distant, had drawn nearer, and ignoring it felt less like neutrality than like a decision carrying consequence. Anna began writing more frequently in her notebook. She did not record the assassination itself or the language used to describe it. Instead, she noted the pauses in her mother's speech, the vacant focus in her father's gaze after supper, the way the house felt heavier despite no visible alteration. She did not know precisely why she wrote these things, only that she felt compelled to fix the present before it shifted again. Nothing dramatic occurred. No single moment demanded action, yet tension settled regardless, shaping thought and expectation. The news that had entered quietly at the kitchen table had completed its journey. It had arrived, and now it waited, asking something of them that none of them yet knew how to articulate, only that remaining exactly as they had been no longer felt entirely possible. The demand, when it finally surfaced, did not arrive with urgency or display. It entered quietly, embedded in routine, framed as prudence rather than conviction. On a weekday morning in the third week of April 1865, a printed notice was affixed to the church door, its corners already beginning to curl where the wood retained moisture from the previous night's rain. It called for a meeting at the village hall along the Lancaster, Philadelphia road. The wording was courteous, even restrained, but edged with necessity. It spoke of safety, vigilance, and the responsibility neighbors bore toward one another in unsettled days, language consistent with notices preserved in township records and local papers during the weeks following the assassination. Isaac read the notice, standing a short distance from the door, his hat held in both hands. He understood at once that the choice implied by the language allowed less freedom than it appeared to offer. The paper did not command, but it narrowed the range of acceptable response. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, carrying it home without comment. With each step across the familiar yard, the paper pressed against his leg, a steady reminder that something had already been set in motion. At the evening meal, Mary recognized his distraction immediately. He ate, responded when spoken to, but his attention drifted repeatedly, as though returning to a point he could not yet approach directly. She did not question him. Years of shared work and circumstance had taught her when inquiry would only harden what was not yet ready to be named. Anna watched them both, conscious that something unspoken had entered the room and taken a place at the table alongside them. The meeting filled the hall beyond its usual capacity. Benches were occupied, and men stood along the walls, coats brushed, hats removed, voices kept deliberately low. Those who had spoken freely only months earlier now weighed their words with care. Reports were offered of unrest moving north from Baltimore and along the rail lines, of anger seeking outlet now that the war had ended without releasing its pressure. Another man mentioned unfamiliar figures on the roads between townships, suggesting the need to protect property and families. No one openly contradicted another speaker. Agreement was assumed even when it was not explicitly stated. When the proposal of organized night patrols was raised, the room fell quiet. The measure was presented as temporary, a precaution rather than an assertion of authority, something to be maintained only until conditions stabilized. Isaac felt the familiar constriction in his chest, the same sensation that had taken whole days earlier in the kitchen when the news from Washington had first been spoken. He could remain seated, allow others to volunteer, preserve the distance he had always kept from collective action of this sort. Or he could raise his hand. He did not later recall a distinct moment of decision. The motion occurred with little conscious deliberation, his arm lifting just enough to be seen. Several others followed. The pause dissolved into subdued approval, and the meeting moved on as though the exchange had been routine. Isaac settled back onto the bench, aware that something fundamental had shifted. He had crossed a boundary that marked itself only in retrospect, but he understood that he would not return to precisely the same position he had occupied before. He told Mary that night without elaboration, only that he would be away some evenings, that it was meant to be temporary. She listened with her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. She did not ask why he had agreed or whether he believed the measure necessary. She understood, perhaps more clearly than he did, that reasoning mattered less than the reality already set in motion. The nights proved colder than anticipated. The men walked the roads in pairs or small groups, lanterns casting brief, shifting light across hedgerows and fence lines. Footsteps sounded louder in the darkness than they did by day. Familiar noises acquired altered significance. A branch snapping underfoot prompted pause. A distant voice sharpened attention without offering clarity. At first, nothing occurred. The absence of incident allowed tension to accumulate, leaving space for speculation to fill what silence withheld. Mary slept lightly during those weeks, waking at minor sounds, marking the hours without intending to do so. She kept the lamp burning later into the evening than she once had, even when no work remained. The habit formed quickly, accompanied by a vigilance that did not recede with daylight. By morning, she resumed her tasks with practiced composure, carrying fatigue without remark. Anna changed in ways that were incremental but evident. She assumed additional responsibility without prompting, watched her brother with increased patience, and spoke less. She sensed that explanations were no longer forthcoming, that understanding would have to be assembled from fragments and observation. Childhood did not end for her in a single, definable moment. It thinned, stretched, and became less dependable. The irreversible moment arrived not as violence, but as knowledge. One night in late April, Isaac did not return at the expected hour. Mary waited at first without alarm, then with a tightening behind her eyes. Dawn approached before information arrived, and when it did, it was incomplete. There had been raised voices on the road near the township boundary. A misunderstanding. A blow struck. Someone detained and taken away. No names were offered. No clear sequence established. An opacity typical of informal security actions documented in rural correspondence from the period. Isaac returned the following afternoon, exhausted in a manner that exceeded loss of sleep. His face showed no injury, but something had settled into him, heavy and resistant to movement. He spoke little, only that events had progressed further than intended, that words had hardened with unexpected speed, that someone else had borne a cost none of them would fully witness. After that night, his participation diminished. He was not formally dismissed, nor did he openly refuse, but his presence became intermittent. The patrols themselves faded gradually in early May, ending without announcement, as though by mutual agreement. Roads returned to their usual quiet, and the matter passed without formal conclusion. Within the community, conversation turned inward. Talk of justice gave way to an emphasis on keeping to one's own affairs. Whatever lesson had been absorbed was not articulated. History had approached closely enough to leave a mark, and few appeared eager to invite it nearer. For Anna, the period formed a boundary she would recognize only later. It was the interval during which she learned that outcomes did not reliably follow intention, and that ordinary people could become implicated in events larger than themselves simply by responding to what seemed necessary at the time. The words spoken quietly at the kitchen table had completed their work. They had moved from report into action, from action into consequences that could not be undone. Nothing dramatic announced the shift. Yet each member of the household understood, in different measure, that they were no longer standing where they once had been. What followed did not resemble resolution. It took the form of settling, like soil disturbed, and then left to still, never returning to its former arrangement. The patrols ended quietly in the first weeks of May 1865. No notice was posted. No meeting convened to declare the danger past. Lanterns simply ceased moving along the roads after nightfall, and the men returned to their beds, as though the interruption had been a brief deviation rather than a distinct episode. Even so, the nights did not immediately recover their earlier character. Silence, once unremarkable, now carried memory. Isaac resumed his full schedule in the fields. From an external view, little appeared altered. He rose before dawn, assessed the sky, worked until his body registered familiar fatigue. The land responded as it always had, indifferent to apprehension or recollection. Corn either emerged or failed. Fences either held or required repair. There was reassurance in that regularity, but also an unspoken recognition that not all matters yielded to effort with the same predictability. At times, standing motionless with a tool in his hands, Isaac felt the residue of those nights on the road, not as images, but as pressure, the awareness of having aligned himself briefly with forces he had neither fully understood nor wholly rejected. Mary adjusted without remark. Accommodation had long been part of her practice, absorbing disruption and reshaping daily routine around it. Certain habits persisted beyond their necessity. She continued to light the lamp earlier in the evening than she once had. She still woke at small sounds. These were not expressions of fear so much as traces of sustained attention, the body retaining vigilance after the mind had ceased to name it urgent. She did not ask Isaac to account for the night he returned late. She understood that explanation, even when offered, does not guarantee clarity. Instead, she directed her effort toward what could still be maintained: meals taken at regular hours, the marking of seasons, the steady labor of care. The church gradually resumed its earlier rhythms, though the congregation itself had shifted in ways not openly discussed. Sermons returned to safer themes. The president's death was now referenced as a historical fact rather than an immediate crisis, his name incorporated into formal remembrance instead of lowered conversation. Even so, whenever Abraham Lincoln was mentioned, a brief stillness followed, an acknowledgement shared without articulation. Heads inclined, eyes lowered, and then the routine of worship continued. Much is recorded in parish minutes and memorial services across Pennsylvania in the late spring of 1865. Anna registered these changes more acutely than others realized. She observed how adults avoided specificity, how conversations curved away from certain subjects before reaching conclusion. She came to understand that silence was not always absence, but sometimes containment. Her childhood did not disappear. It receded unevenly. There remained moments of ease, of laughter, of ordinary impatience. Interwoven with them, however, was a growing awareness that the world did not reliably provide explanation or proportionate outcome. She learned that participation did not require enthusiasm, only presence, and that withdrawal could itself carry consequence. Over time, she wrote less. The notebook remained, but its function altered. It ceased to serve as a daily record and became instead a place for fragments, observations without resolution, thoughts without closure. She began to sense that memory did not preserve events intact. It retained impressions, tonal shifts, the sensation of standing at a window, while something irrevocable took shape elsewhere. Her younger brother retained little from that spring. For him, the period existed only as an indistinct interval of routine and growth. In later years, he might recall his father's fatigue, his mother's quiet, but not the tension itself. He would not remember fear. This understanding offered Anna a form of comfort she did not express. Some weight, she recognized, did not need to be borne evenly. Years afterward, when the assassination of April 1865 was presented as a defining national moment, it would not summon for this household images of a Washington theater or public mourning. It would recall instead a kitchen table near midday, a man with road dust on his boots asking for water, a voice lowered by instinct rather than instruction. It would be remembered not as spectacle, but as intrusion, the point at which something expansive entered a confined, ordinary space and did not depart unchanged. Life continued as it did. Crops were planted and harvested. Children grew. The farm remained where it had always been, subject to weather, labor, and time. Nothing about it appeared exceptional. Embedded within those routines, however, was an understanding that had not existed before, that history does not belong solely to those whose names endure in print. It also resides in pauses, in choices made without certainty, in consequences that settle quietly and remain. No one in that household would later claim to have witnessed history. They would not have described themselves as participants in it. Yet it had passed through them all the same, altering the structure of their days, instructing them without announcement or ceremony that even the most ordinary lives can be permanently shaped by events that arrive uninvited, speak softly, and leave behind a silence that never fully recedes. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps ensure that these quiet, often forgotten stories continue to be shared. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We also invite you to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our viewers come from many places and generations, connected by a shared respect for history and the lives that lived it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.